Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for inviting me. So I'll do a very general introduction to biodiversity offsetting. And if ever, it's too simple or you want to know more, I'm happy to expand beyond that. But I will start with a very generic introduction, and I will share my screen. Okay, so the topic today is biodiversity offsetting, which is something that has been on the drawing board for more than a decade, but it's coming up over the next 2 years, both at EU and UN level. So this is really, like I said earlier, a very general introduction, and to try and understand what it is not, and what are the questions raised by it. So I'm guessing, I don't know if, so okay, let's start with the beginning. There is this concept that has been promoted for a number of years now, called natural capital. I don't know if you're familiar with it. In a nutshell, natural capital is a reconceptualization of nature, where nature is considered as a series of services that contribute to human well-being. Everything that is not contributing to human well-being is deemed worthless and can be destroyed for free. This is obviously a major conceptual shift, right? Because nature is considered to have zero intrinsic value under this approach. I will not get into all the major flawed assumptions underlying this idea. Just to mention a few, this is based on the idea that we should put a price on nature to save it, and that monetary incentive would work better than traditional environmental regulation. In fact, it's been demonstrated that it is not the case. Traditional environmental regulation have an excellent track record. Think of, for example, the Montreal Protocol on the CFC gases that cause the hole in the ozone layer. Think also of the ban on asbestos. Think of, there's so many examples, and traditional environmental regulations work fantastically well in general. There just haven't been enough. There is the idea also may seem intuitive that putting a price on nature would work better, but let me give you a counterexample. Imagine you're the owner of a coffee plantation in Costa Rica, right? And your plantation is next to a forest which hosts a colony of bees. Well, in this case, it would seem to work because the owner of the coffee plantation would be incentivized he needs the bees for his crops. And he could be interested in paying the forest owner not to cut the forest, in order for the bees to help with his coffee crops. Now imagine the next year, the coffee plantation owner switches crops from coffee to pineapples. Well, then in this case, he no longer needs the bees. And in fact, the bees may damage his crops. So he may be incentivized to pay the owner to cut the forest. And this is obviously just an anecdotal example, but this is to show that conservation based on monetary incentive is far more fickle than based on traditional environmental regulation. In a nutshell, also, it's very important to realize that for all the talk about putting a price on nature, this is not what is being done. This is not what is being done because it cannot be done. First of all, in practice, when you look at what is being done by these models, and the main model is one developed by the UN called SEEA.EA. Well, they look only at the 2 or 3 main ecosystem services and ignore the rest, because modeling everything would be too complicated and too costly. So what is being measured is not nature, is not even a proxy, and that is obviously very problematic. In one of the case studies that they give, they look at, for example, the chemical pollution of a river, and the way to assess the monetary value of the damage is only through considering the number of fishing days that have been lost. Obviously, that totally ignores the impact on the local flora, fauna, etc. This is an incredibly simplistic approach that is absolutely lacking environmental integrity. Now, adding to that, there's a number of research that has shown that the monetary valuation methodologies that are being used are incredibly biased. relying on surveys or other approaches. And I'm happy to direct you to sources if you want to investigate that point. But so if you add the fact that what is being measured is an incredibly simplistic and partial view of nature and very biased monetary evaluation methodologies, then you end up with values that are entirely meaningless and may facilitate nature's destruction because it looks so cheap. So that's the concept of natural capital. And I'm talking about it because this monetary evaluation underlies biodiversity offsetting and is the first step. So what is offsetting? Offsetting, you may have heard of carbon offsetting, right? Offsetting is the idea that we may be able to compensate for the destruction of biodiversity in one place through some actions, such as, for example, restoring a habitat for some species at a different time and place, right? So the way it works is that typically you're supposed to follow the so-called mitigation hierarchy, where, for example, you're a developer, you're a real estate developer, you want to build an airport or a highway or a dam. And you're supposed to first try to avoid any negative impact on biodiversity. And then you're supposed to minimize the impact that is not avoidable, and then to rehabilitate. And then at the last step, offset any residual impact. In practice, the problem is that there is no clear guidance on when to go from one step to another. And so it's very easy to go directly to the last step because it's the cheapest. If you think about it, it's so much cheaper for a real estate developer to pay for a project to plant some trees or restore a habitat somewhere than to try to avoid destruction, which would curb his profits, right? So, and there are different types of biodiversity offsetting, and this is where it gets really interesting. Let's take an example. Imagine there is this company who wants to build an airport in the south of Spain over a flamingo habitat, right? You have three cases. The first case is a traditional environmental regulation, where the company would be told, no, you cannot do your airport here, you have to do it somewhere else, right? The second case is traditional or classic biodiversity offsetting, or also called like for like. And here the company would be told, okay, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate by recreating a habitat for flamingos within, I don't know, 10 kilometers. And then you have an extreme version of biodiversity offsetting called like for like or better, which is a very misleading name. And here the company would be told, okay, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate somewhere in the world or somewhere in the EU, and not by recreating a habitat for flamingos, but by an ecosystem service of equivalent monetary value. So, for example, if you plant trees in Romania, or if you restore a habitat for bats in Greece, that could be considered appropriate as long as you demonstrate that it is better. Obviously, this is an approach that has a very low environmental integrity. This is also the approach that is being currently promoted by the European Commission. So the question you may ask is, how do we determine what is better? Well, in practice, this is not really clear. If you look at, for example, the European Commission approach, which has been promoted since 2010, it says that better is used when there is no, so it says that you have three types of equivalency analysis, right, to determine the amount of compensation. The first is resource equivalency analysis. The second type is habitat equivalency analysis. Resource would be the number of hectares times the percentage of the status, etc. Habitat would be the type of habitat. And value equivalency analysis is monetary evaluation. And again, it's all in the detail, because they say that in practice, we're supposed to use resource of habitat equivalency analysis. But in reality, you can use value equivalency analysis, i.e. monetary evaluation, pretty much with a lot of discretion whenever you want. The criteria to use it is if there is nothing equivalent in the area, or if equivalent remediation would be disproportionately costly, or if compensating with a similar service is deemed undesirable. And now the following question you may ask yourself is, what is disproportionately costly? Well, here again, I mean, if you look at the details, there's a number of criteria, such as if you would threaten the economic viability of a sector, and or ultimately the political decision. The point is, the criteria used to determine when you should compensate with the same species, the same habitat that was destroyed or not, is, by the Commission's own acknowledgement, very subjective and a political decision, not a scientific decision. That is obviously very problematic, because that means very low environmental integrity for these schemes. Now, you may ask yourself, why would we promote such a crazy biodiversity offsetting where you can compensate one species by another? Well, the reason is because by doing so, you can create a market. If the restoration has to be site-specific, destruction-specific, right? Then you cannot create a market, because this is not harmonized, this is not standardized. Now, if on the other hand, the restoration is generic, right? It's no longer specific to any site or any destruction, then you can restore habitats in advance and generate offset credits, which are really permits to destroy elsewhere. And until the new credits are being used, then you can freely trade them. And this is how you create a market on a biodiversity destruction, on the price of biodiversity destruction. And so that explains the choice of such an approach. So now, obviously, there are a very large number of problems with this approach to conservation. And the first one is the one that I mentioned, which is the absolute lack of environmental integrity. I mean, more bats do not equal less flamingos. And then you have a lot of other, and I mean, we have a track record, I mean, of biodiversity offsetting, because it already exists in some areas like Canada or the US or Australia, with an appalling track record. I mean, with the project on average I think on average 2/3 of the project have failed to achieve their restoration objectives. And likewise, we have known, you know, from carbon offsetting that, I mean, offsetting has a very bad track record for carbon as well. In the word of, according to a study from the European Commission, 85% of Kyoto carbon offset credits have failed. So, I mean, offsetting has a terrible track record, and we have a lot of data, because this has started, what, in 2008? Another issue of offsetting is that many projects have been associated with human rights abuse and land grabbing. Why? Because if you look for land where to restore or to plant trees, etc., obviously you will go where land is cheapest, which is very often on indigenous land, where property rights are not really formalized, obviously, and leading to land grabbing. And then once you grab the land and you prevent the local populations to coming back on the land and call them poachers, and if they try to come back, there's been a lot of cases of beatings, rapes, and murders. Another point that is very important to clarify here is that restoration in itself is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but it is a good thing only if it comes instead, in addition to curbing destruction, right? And not instead of. And so that is really the problem here with biodiversity offsetting. Restoration is good, but restoration should never be considered as offsetting, and should be never financed through offset schemes. Because if you do so, then it comes instead of curbing destruction, right? And this is very problematic, because offsetting by definition does not curb destruction, it displaces destruction, right? The two other major issues with biodiversity offsetting is that they divert the conversation away from the need to curb destruction. And all the talk about offsetting essentially is about, rather than changing our lifestyle in rich countries and curbing our destruction of negative footprint on nature, this is about maintaining our lifestyle, maintaining the focus on maximizing economic growth, and pretending to compensate elsewhere generally in poor countries. I mean, this is not a new story in this sense. I mean, biodiversity offsetting is just a continuation, an extension of carbon offsetting, which in a nutshell is about, instead of changing our lifestyle in rich countries, it's about planting a few trees in poor countries and claiming it compensates, which it does not. So politically, this is very useful for the vested interest and proponents of the status quo, because it diverts the conversation away from the need for new environmental regulation curbing instruction. But it is also a tremendous business opportunity. I mean, one thing that a lot of people fail to see is that the financial sector is already on board. I mean, they're already on board with this transition. They've realized that there's far more money to be made from this new so-called environmental asset class than from financing coal. According to a report from the World Economic Forum, climate finance and biodiversity finance represent a $10 trillion business opportunity. And the last angle that is really important and too often overlooked is that offsetting is a major threat multiplier and is about to change scale completely. I mean, for now, offsetting, I mean, has been in existence for a few decades, but it was a niche market, right? It generated a lot of issues, to be clear, but it was a niche market, not very big, and it's about to change scale and grow exponentially due to 4 factors, right? The first factor is that carbon offsetting is growing massively. 3 new international markets were created in 2021. You had CORSIA for international flights emission. You had a market linked to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that was finalized at the COP26. And you had China, who launched its own carbon market. So that's one factor. The second factor is biodiversity offsetting, which was essentially on the drawing board since 2010 and is now coming up, as we will see, both at EU and UN level. The third factor is that all these offsets, carbon and biodiversity, are now considered as part of green finance, according to the EU taxonomy, the EU legislation, which means, in turn, that a significant proportion of the trillions of assets under management in Europe will now be directed towards offset projects. Now, imagine the scale of this. Imagine the wall of money compared to the little land available, and what impact it will have. And then finally, now there is a big process underway this year about tokenizing this offset to transform them into allegedly crypto green assets. And again, this will bring more money. This will bring a significant part of the crypto money into the offset world. And the result of that will be far too much money chasing far too little land available to plant trees or restore habitats. And the impact of that will be a massive risk of conflicts over land and conflicts over land use and related impacts in terms of migrations, but also exploding food prices. So this is why this approach is extremely problematic. Now, why is this relevant today? Why are we talking about it today? Well, first of all, it's important to realize that there is a sort of linguistic warfare around these issues. As more and more people have realized that offsetting does not offset. Offsetting is a word that has somehow disappeared to be now increasingly called nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. And so what a few MEPs have done with us over the past months is to challenge the European Commission on this topic. And so we asked the Commission whether its definition of nature-based solution included biodiversity offsetting. And they responded yes. Biodiversity offsetting is something that we promote as part of nature-based solution. And then we asked them, all right, so what is the geographical scope? Is it, can you compensate anywhere in the world or in the EU, or does it have to be in the same country? And they said, well, it has to be in the EU. And we also asked them, all right, and what kind of biodiversity offsetting are you promoting? Is it the like for like, that is the same species that you destroy that you need to restore? Or is it the like for like or better, which means, you know, you can change species, etc. And At first, they did not respond. And then we asked again the Commission, and they finally responded that this is the like for like or better approach. So now we know for sure that the European Commission is actively promoting the like for like or better biodiversity offsetting. And this is not anecdotal because this is nature-based solutions now appear in most EU regulation. There was recently a delegated act on climate change adaptation, and almost every activity mentioned nature-based solution. So it's really important to understand what lies behind nature-based solutions. To be clear, the nature-based solution is broader than biodiversity and carbon offsetting, but it's incredibly used as synonymous by the proponents of these approaches. Likewise, in the latest IPCC report that was published recently, the term nature-based solutions appeared 285 times. So it's really important to understand this linguistic cat and mouse game to be able to challenge this offsetting that and as part of nature-based solutions. So this is, you have also to realize that there is a very, very organized corporate lobby campaign promoting this, this approach. With when you look in the details, there's always the same suspects, same corporations, the same people behind this this campaign, but they have a number of fronts. They're increasing new so-called NGOs or shops continuously, from Business for Nature, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, the Capitals Coalition. The latest one that was launched a few days ago only is a task force on nature markets. I mean, there's an incredibly well-organized and well-funded campaign to promote this. This is also being promoted by the World Bank, the UN, and the OECD. So, and facing that, civil society is increasingly realizing what stands behind this nature-based solution and why they're problematic. But it's also divided. You have on one hand, big conservation NGOs like the Nature Conservancy or WWF, who have typically endorsed the financialization of nature. And on the other hand, you have indigenous rights organizations who have opposed it because they have seen the impact on the ground and the tremendous damage that this approach has caused. So what is the timeline? Well, I mean, at the EU level, the European Commission has been pushing this approach since 2010 through a legislative proposal that was called habitat banking. And that was already promoting the like for like or better biodiversity offsetting. It tried to attempt it in 2014 through a fitness test of the Habitats and Birds Directive. And there was a public uproar and they backed down. And now we feel that it's coming up again, and it may happen this year or next. And if you look at the EU legislative framework and biodiversity strategy, it is based on net gain principle. And net means offsetting by definition, right? I mean, you mix together restoration and curbing destruction, and you consider that both offset each other. So that is problematic. And then the European Commission is expected to publish on the 22nd of June this year legislative proposals introducing mandatory restoration targets. And of course, in itself, it's not necessarily bad, but the devil, as always, is in the details. And what is missing to create such a market at EU level is precisely an obligation to restore, right? I mean, if you think of what happened with climate change and carbon markets were created by the mandatory requirement for polluters to have credits. While likewise, what is only missing at EU level to create a market on biodiversity offsetting is a legislation mandating the need to offset or restore. So we will look very closely at this new legislative proposal to see whether it promotes or not biodiversity offsetting, and if it does, what kind, etc. Likewise, at UN level, there's a similar concept called land degradation neutrality. Again, this is not a very unclear name, and this is very democratically problematic. The UN has also been promoting, as part of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and we have seen leaked draft, a number of keywords that indicate very strongly that it fosters biodiversity offsetting. It calls to integrate biodiversity values, which means put a price on nature. It mentions nature's contribution to people, which is the other name for ecosystem services, and it calls for net improvements, and net meaning offsetting. So here again, there is a very important development this year, which will be the CBD COP15 and the Biodiversity COP. And we will monitor very closely whether what emerges of this COP will promote biodiversity offsetting or not. I mean, there's a lot of indication that it might, given all the work that's been done and the fact that these approaches have been promoted for a number of years. So this is why 2022 is a crucial year for these approaches. And so that's pretty much where we stand politically. And this is really now the time to raise awareness and to mobilize against these approaches, because these approaches, again, come instead of curbing destruction. And this is about maintaining the status quo and continuing with the same paradigm of maximizing economic growth as opposed to finally changing lifestyle. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing is to have an informed public debate, which has been entirely missing. And that requires knowing what lies behind these innocuous sounding names like nature-based solutions, and then challenging the offsetting approach and requesting, for example, that we replace the net zero targets or net gain principles by separate targets for curbing destruction and restoration. And there is a lot of things that can be done. I mean, a number of NGOs are working on these issues, such as Survival International or Friend of the Earth, etc. And I will leave you with a final word. Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission, once said, "The only thing that makes me change my policies is 1 billion people in the street." And I believe this was a very candid statement. And I believe that is also part of the way forward. Thank you very much.